Open a South Bend newspaper on any afternoon in the 1850s, 60s, or 70s, and you're likely to find a story boasting about the success and ingenuity of one of the city's young, burgeoning businesses. The newspapermen will tell you why profits are higher than ever before, why South Bend-made products are of such higher quality than all other competitors. They will lionize the men who run those operations as the most moral, upright, clever, and hardworking individuals in their fields. An 1873 newspaper might have boasted of many of the businesses we've discussed already in this season. Maybe you'd discover an article about the South Bend Toy Company or the Staley Woolen Mills. Of course, you would also find plenty about Studebaker wagons and Oliver plows and Singer sewing machine cabinets, along with dozens of other businesses that burned bright for months and years and decades at a time. South Bend's industrial trials, tribulations, curiosities, and victories ran like soap operas, told in articles spread out across years of newspaper columns. And if the newspaper man had any say, it was always the good guys, South Bend's business elite, who would win the day. But there was one business you weren't likely to find celebrated in those old newspapers. A company that had by then become synonymous with South Bend, whose buildings would stand until 2024, and whose name has echoed throughout the city's northwest side for more than 150 years. I'm talking about the Muessel Brewing Company, a South Bend original if there ever was one. Founded in 1852, the same year the Studebaker brothers opened their blacksmith shop and 13 years before the incorporation of South Bend, Muessel is older than any of the other companies we've discussed this season. In the second half of the 1800s, the Muessel Brewing Company was as well-known an outfit as any of those other ones, everywhere except the pages of the local press. The temperance-minded editors of the newspapers were loath to provide free publicity for the Bavarian beer makers just northwest of the city's limits, quick to seize on the bad news, and letting anything like good news seep between their fingers. If the Muessels wanted to get their names in the paper, they were going to have to make the kind of news the editors couldn't ignore. And for 70 years, that's exactly what they did. So today, on A Bend in Time, we are pouring you a tall glass of history, tracing the rise and legacy of this family-owned brewery that quenched the thirst of a growing city, fought against the temperance movement, and left an imprint on the community that lingers to this day. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series we are going to dive into some of the fun and forgotten businesses of South Bend, running the gamut from toys to bait to underwear to newspapers. During this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's go to the town of Auersburg in Bavaria, now a part of Germany, all the way back to 1812. That's when our protagonist, Johann Christoph Muessel, was born, the son of the brewer and the grandson of a brewer too. He came from quite a line of beer makers, and in the Bavarian culture, that made him a pretty big deal back in Auersburg. Things got tough in Auersburg during the 1840s and 1850s, and with the village tossed back and forth between warring kingdoms, a significant part of the town's population set off for the United States. Most of them landed in South Bend, Indiana, and to this day, Auersburg and South Bend share a sister city relationship. Once Johann Christoph made it to the States, he Americanized his name and was known from that point as simply Christoph Muessel and sometimes Christopher Muessel. Now 40 years old, he set to the work he'd done for decades, establishing his first brewing operation at the southeast corner of what would later become Washington and Michigan Streets. Muessel was successful almost immediately. It's difficult to overstate just how important Bavarian beer is to the Bavarian tradition, And with a significant population of thirsty immigrants, Muessel would have made a tidy profit if he only served the beer-loving Germans who came over with him. But of course, while puritanical fifth-generation Americans may have held their noses in judgment at the way Muessel made his living, South Bend was a growing city of immigrants who had no such qualms. Waves of Irishmen poured into the city, followed by Polish immigrants, and Christopher Muessel made sure there was plenty to go around. Muessel spent 18 years at that first downtown location, but as his business grew, he needed more space and more amenities. When South Bend City Council denied his request to build a drain from the factory into the East Race, Christopher took their refusal as a sign. In 1870, he purchased property just northwest of the city limits at 1408 Elwood Avenue and built a brewery complex that would stand until 2024. It was at this point that the South Bend Tribune pretty much stopped reporting on the goings-on of the Muessel Brewing Company. The paper's editors were hardline temperance who advocated total abstinence from the evils of alcohol, and they weren't about to give free publicity to a brewery. And now, with the operations moved just outside of the city limits, they had even more of an excuse not to cover the brewery, except when there was bad news. When it came to alcohol, the Tribune was quick to seize on bad news, like when public drunkenness caused public nuisance, when someone in the Muessel Brewery was arrested for selling alcohol on Sundays, when workers went down with heat stroke, or when a horrible accident at the beer factory mutilated and killed a young man named Jacob Welches in 1873. Despite all of that, business was still good. Plenty of beer was produced, lots of people had decent jobs, and Christopher Muessel was making a lot of money, enough to buy up wide swaths of land and to dedicate some of that land as a public park. It wasn't a city park, and it couldn't have been. Muessel's land wasn't in the city. It wasn't a county park either. It was Muessel's park, land that he owned, that he maintained, and that he cared for on his own dime, and then invited the public to use for pleasure, for picnics, and for ball games with no fees and no questions asked. The first mentions of Muessel Grove Park appeared in the newspapers in 1878, more than 20 years before Howard Park became the city's first official park. The newspapers might not have been excited to run news about the Muessel Brewery, but they couldn't help but run the family's name in their columns when Muessel Grove Park hosted some of the most exciting events of the time: Old Settlers picnics, public concerts featuring the L. Bell Brothers Band, Sunday school gatherings, and early baseball games. By 1880, it was even news when hundreds lined up to celebrate the release of Muessel's annual Easter Bock beer, something that the newspapers called one of the surest signs of spring. And of course, no matter how temperance-minded it was unconscionable for any newspaper to turn down advertising dollars. The first ads for Muessel beer began in 1880 and would run almost daily for the next 40 years. Besides their brews, the Muessels stayed in the news for plenty of other reasons. In 1892, Christopher's grandson, Walter Muessel, was a star halfback for the Purdue football team, one that claimed a championship with a dominant and undefeated season. That same year, Christopher Muessel announced plans to build a hotel on the land he still owned downtown. The Grand View Hotel opened on August 5, 1893, at the site of the former brewery and what would later become the College Football Hall of Fame, a part of the varied holdings of the newly incorporated Muessel Brewing Company. But most of all, there was the beer. Muessel brewed their Bavarian beer and their standard beer year-round, with that Bock on tap across South Bend every March. Walter Muessel returned from Purdue in 1893 and took a job in the family business. On the side, he became a football coach, teaming up with J.M. Studebaker Jr. to coach the Notre Dame squad to a 4-1 record. Notre Dame's official records indicate that the school didn't hire its first football coach until a year later in 1894, but the South Bend Tribune told stories of Studebaker and Muessel coaching up the Notre Dame team. It is probable that this discrepancy is due to the fact that the pair were volunteering their time with the team and not acting in any official capacity. 40 years after coming to America, Christopher Muessel had seen every part of that fabled American dream. Property ownership, business success, the esteem and respect of his community, even from those teetotaling newspaper editors. Even those editors had nothing but good things to say about Christopher Muessel when he died on March 25, 1894, at the age of 82. His son, Edward Muessel, would take over the family business, and a new era in South Bend's beer community was about to begin. We'll catch up with all of that right after the break.
Do you wish for radishes? If so, we want you to see ours. Fresh, crisp, and full of flavor. Not the fair to look upon, but full of nothingness kind. Oh no, something your teeth will penetrate with a feeling of solid satisfaction. Fat, squatty ones, or long fellows, white or red, take your choice. Why, sir, you can make a most enjoyable meal with them with bread, butter, and a cup of tea or coffee. Pick up a bunch of beauties today at L. Nickel Jr. & Co. Grocers at 119 North Main Street. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The death of the brewery's patriarch would not stymie its operations. 6 months after the man's death, Muessel introduced another seasonal beer, the Holiday Brew, in December. The company built its own waterworks, added new equipment, and erected new buildings. But don't take this spending spree as a sign that the men running the place were anything but thrifty. In 1898, a Muessel worker was painting a derrick at the plant. At his lunch break, he left 5 gallons of green paint beneath a tree, and after he'd eaten his fill, he returned to find his paint pail empty. And let's just let the South Bend Tribune take it from here. For a long time, the man was completely at a loss to account for the disappearance of the paint, but finally his eyes fell on the green, besmeared countenance of a docile old cow, and instantly had a solution of the problem flash through his mind. Old Hoss had drank the paint. While the painter was watching the cow with a sort of pitiful expression in his eyes, the inflated animal gave a frantic lurch forward and fell to the ground dead. Simultaneously with the death of the cow came an idea to the painter. Why not cut the cow open and recover the paint? Once conceived, the idea was hastily put into execution, and the senseless old cow's blood had not grown cold before the painter was slapping his brush on the derrick, spreading the liquid that killed the cow that drank the paint that stood in a bucket under a tree. Of course, all of the paint was not discovered, but the loss was surprisingly slight. The cow has not corroborated the story. And yes, I could use an Easter Bach to get the taste of that story out of my mouth. The next big year in Muessel's history came in 1900. That's when the hotel it owned in downtown South Bend burned down, killing 9, and sparking insurance litigation that would last for years. That was also the year that the Muessel baseball team won the South Bend championship behind the brilliant pitching of one-arm Schmalz Reed. And it's when Muessel released the newest brew to its permanent lineup, the Arsberg Export. But even though things were good in South Bend, there were persistent whispers that threatened to crush Muessel's business and to wipe out an important part of its Bavarian heritage. The enemy went by many names: temperance, prohibition, abstinence. But no matter the name, the goal was the same: ending or minimizing the consumption of alcohol. Muessel faced the problem head-on, running 2 or 3 advertisements in the newspapers every day for 20 years, extolling the virtues of beer. An ad in 1902 carried the slogan, "Do you value your health? If so, drink Muessel beer." Muessel beer was a mild, stimulating, cooling, refreshing, wholesome, healthful thirst annihilator. It was a bone-building tonic. It contained important food and tonic qualities. Physicians recommended it. Besides recommending beer in place of tea or coffee, other ads encouraged people to drink beer instead of taking medicine. Beer was boasted as a cure for gray hair and depression. Another campaign encouraged people to drink beer instead of eating food. When typhoid hit South Bend in 1909, citizens were encouraged to drink beer instead of water. Most curiously, Muessel attempted the strategy of trying to persuade readers that Muessel beer was the favorite beer of temperance workers, taking out space in the paper to run ads promoting beer as a temperance drink since its alcohol content was so much lower than wine and spirits. In the middle of all of that, it launched a new beer called Silver Edge. It also started a football team and brought in a real ringer to coach the guys up. None other than Newt Rockne, still a senior at Notre Dame, and now making a few dollars on the side coaching an 11-man squad called the Measles in 1913. Unlike the baseball team that had won the 1900 championship, this was not a factory team, and these guys were not amateurs. They were paid football players and a very real, low-level professional team. Muessel finished the 1913 season with no losses and just one tie, earning a strange and unsatisfying nod as the city's secondary champions. During the 1914 season, the brewery sponsored two teams, the Measles and the Silver Edge. They hired Rockne to coach both teams, an arrangement that was never fully explained, especially when the two teams played each other to open the season. Strange as that was, it was far from the real drama of the season. That would come in November, when Rockne allegedly brought on 5 freshman ringers from the Notre Dame squad to suit up for the Silver Edge in an important game. For Rockne, the racket was a win-win-win. Notre Dame freshmen weren't eligible to play with the team on game days, so getting his prized freshmen some game experience was a boon for their development. It also helped his Silver Edge win an important game and put some money into the pockets of his young freshmen and future stars. Players were paid by the game in those times, and when the 5 Notre Dame students suited up for the Silver Edge, that meant 5 regulars didn't. It also meant they missed out on game checks. With bruised egos and deflated wallets, the story went that the 5 displaced players squealed on the Notre Dame men, a group that allegedly included Jimmy Phelan, who would go on to play quarterback for Notre Dame in 1915, 1916, and 1917. The accusations were never fully proven, but the circumstantial evidence was more than plentiful. In the aftermath of the episode, Notre Dame suspended 5 football players, and Rockne was told by the school that he would no longer be able to pursue outside coaching gigs. The next season, the Measles and Silver Edge teams were combined, and even without Rockne to coach them, they won the Indiana State football title in 1915. It was a high point in a long line of victories for the Muessel Brewing Company. It sponsored a champion, and maybe it was partly because of that sponsorship that the Silver Edge became the brewery's most popular offering. But even besides that, Muessel's real estate offerings were paying enormous dividends. The brewing company held hundreds of acres of land beyond their brew works, and it subdivided those lots to sell to home buyers in a new neighborhood called Muessel's Addition. It finally sold the downtown space that had been the original brewery and the burnt hotel. It even gave land to the city for construction of a new school, and when Muessel Elementary School opened in 1906, it marked an important moment in the life of a family and a business that had once largely been shut out of the newspapers because of their line of work. Now, the Muessel name was visible in large letters atop South Bend's newest school building. With all of that success under their belts, the family business didn't need a state champion football team to legitimize their place in South Bend, but it was an awful nice cherry on top. The championship was won in November 1915, and it cleanly delineated the highest point in the history of the Muessel Brewing Company. But things weren't going to stay like this forever. National Prohibition advocates were loud and growing louder. Walter Muessel even picked a fight with National Prohibitionist figure Billy Sunday in a Logansport newspaper. Sunday had given an anti-alcohol sermon in Logansport attended by hundreds, and Muessel was quoted as saying that he didn't think Sunday's speech was very compelling. Walter Muessel was surprised when he learned that public sentiment wasn't necessarily on his side. Then there were other forces, even more sinister, and they were ready to pounce even as the celebration of the football championship echoed throughout South Bend. All that and more after the break.
Start the new year of 1916 by catching a show at the Colonial Theater, 129 North Michigan Street in South Bend. The Colonial is thrilled to present Lillian Lorraine in the strikingly beautiful and original 5-part photo drama, Should a Wife Forgive? It's a story of intense emotional force in which a man of the world learns a bitter lesson. And it's also a fine comedy. Only at the Colonial. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
It was close of business at the brewery on December 30th, 1915, about 5:30 p.m., and there were only a few workers left in the office to close up shop for the night. General Manager Henry Muessel, his sons William and Robert, and a delivery driver named Frank Crobett. That's when the armed bandits showed up to rob the place. By the time the incident ended, the bandits had absconded with the money, and Henry Muessel and Frank Crobett were dead. William was shot and bleeding out, whisked away to Epworth Hospital. Robert, the youngest, was safely hidden. The news shocked South Benders when they woke up and read their newspapers on New Year's Eve, 1915. Many of the evening galas and celebrations were canceled. The bandits had escaped, and there was very little optimism that they would be apprehended. The Muessel Brewing Company mourned. The city mourned. The Muessel family mourned. Policemen chased down leads for years, even arresting 2 men for the murders in 1916 before fully clearing them of the crime a few days later. By 1920, the case was a cold one, and it might have stayed that way forever if a man named August Schultz had the capacity to be kind to his wife. The pair were living in Chicago in March 1920. Schultz's wife decided he'd mistreated her for the last time, and she sought her revenge by telling police the dirt she had on her husband. August Schultz had been involved with the Muessel Brewery murders. Schultz was quickly arrested, where he confessed to being the getaway driver, but maintained that he was not the gunman and was not in the room where it happened. Hoping to gain mercy for himself, he implicated his accomplices, Jack Wright and Charles Danruther, as the men who were responsible for the murders. A 6-month manhunt led by the Pinkertons finally found Jack Wright in Detroit in September 1920. Danruther was never apprehended and was believed to have died in South America. Both Wright and Schultz were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. It might have been some amount of closure for the family and the company, but it was just about the only good news it would receive that year. The nation went dry in 1920. The Muessel Brewing Company tried to hang on, manufacturing a few non-alcoholic near-beer products, but these were unsuccessful. The factory closed up entirely in 1922, and it seemed to be the end of the Muessel story. Members of the Muessel family retired if they could afford to retire. The rest found other work, many in real estate. The last one out of the brewery turned off the lights, and that's the way they stayed. At least until 1932. That year brought the announcement that Prohibition would be ending. Muessel began preparations to work again, and on October 26, 1933, Silver Edge beer was available to be enjoyed by the public. The company was up and running, now under new leadership. Its president was D. Sherman Ellison, the first man outside the family to run operations. But operations were difficult. After sitting empty and unmaintained for 10 years, the factory needed $450,000 worth of expenditures to get it running again. Silver Edge sales were good, but they weren't that good. In 1936, Drew Rees Limited bought out the Muessel Brewing Company and moved production of Drew Rees Extra Dry to South Bend. For the next 3 decades, the factory would employ hundreds at a time, even expanding operations in 1967 with peak production of 1 million bottles annually. In 1972, Drew Rees was sold and the factory was closed. The Prohibition years notwithstanding, it had been a run of 120 years. Those buildings stood and resisted destruction for 50 more years, but they never found the redevelopment the city hoped they might. After becoming an eyesore and a public nuisance, the old Muessel Brewing Company was razed to the ground in 2024. Muessel Grove Park went on to become a city-owned property. It's still there, just like the Muessel Elementary School, and it's a strange, enduring legacy for the Bavarian beer makers, a family who may have never imagined that the place their name would remain the longest would be at the place where children play and receive educations. But if you think this development would have shocked the family, then just imagine the surprise of the newspaper man who never wanted to write the Muessel name in the first place. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode will cover the South Bend News Times, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.